Without further delay, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Fabrizio Gallai, who will be talking to us about relevance theory and informed approaches and relevance theoretically informed approaches to translation and interpreting while taking into account training and practice. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stavros. So first things first, this is, as you said, a talk on translation and interpreting. So I'm picking up from what I left from my talk a couple of months back, about 4 months ago, within this circuit. First of all, I'll start off by giving you an introduction on the topic. Not all of you will be familiar with training and practice in translation and interpreting. Then I'll focus on theory and practice and move on to some conclusions. Relevance theory and translation interpreting. Well, first of all, in translation interpreting studies, we look out for quality and competence, as you might know. So, and also we try and see how translation interpreting work in the first place. So those are the two big question marks in my field of study. Over the last 3 decades, there has been growing interest in both the production of translation interpreting and the cognitive aspects of these processes. And relevance theory has been used by a number of scholars, and it's indeed the only theoretical framework in the area of cognitive pragmatics today that has been adopted to understand the complexity of translator and interpreter mediated communication. So far, so good. Now, let's have a look at why there's been this increasing popularity for relevance theory in my field. Well, obviously, work of professionals in this field is underpinned by both linguistic and cognitive abilities. So obviously, an appropriate framework for capturing these acts must relate these activities to the mental processes as well, and thus relevant theory. However, it has been misapplied in my field by a number of researchers, and it's been both presented as a training method and it's been and sometimes their analysis fails to consider the special situation of mediated events. Thus, my volume that this talk's taken from, in a way, especially chapter 5, that's gonna come out in a month's time, hopefully, with Taylor and Francis, and which obviously seeks to provide a cognitive-based account of translation interpreting and show you how to use this framework to analyze translation and interpreting events. So moving on to our second point, the theoretical applications of relevance theory in translation interpreting field. Well, first of all, the significance of this theory in my field of study has been on a number of levels. First of all, it's been seen as a plausible account of the dynamic nature of human communication, including obviously translation interpreting. So it's a way to study the individual differences amongst communicator and audience, and how these differences may cause the complexity of contexts that are established online rather than a priori. Secondly, it's a good way of showing the cause-effect framework of cognitive efforts in translation interpreting, obviously. As Gut says, it helps to predict communication problems when the audience lacks ready access to certain pieces of information. And thirdly, it advocates the economical use of cognitive efforts to achieve the best communicative effect in translation and interpreting. I've mentioned Gut because he is, and if you've where my speech a couple of months back, you know, he is the main scholar in my field. Good's approach has been adopted by many translation interpreting scholars over the years. According to this approach, very quickly, translation falls within the domain of communication. Translator and interpreter, they mediate between the intentions and evidences of the source text and the target text, which is an ostensive stimulus defined as a case of interlingual interpretive use. Interlingual interpretive use. So if you're familiar with relevance theoretic framework, then you know what I'm talking about. If you see translation interpreting as a case of interlingual interpreting use, it makes sense to say that the study of the process of translation interpreting should focus on the comparison of interpretations, not on the reproduction of words, linguistic constructions, or textual features. So this is quite a leap from some of the studies that have been carried out in my field of research. So translation is an extensive communicative act, and it depends on the interplay between psychological context or cognitive environment of the utterance, or a written piece of text, and processing effort, which is required to derive contextual effect. So translating and interpreting is a process which involves establishing a chain of resemblance relations between a set of interpretations. This is what Good said in 1991. And in order to ensure this interpretive resemblance, professionals make use of metacognitive abilities and activities through monitoring processes. So this is the this slide shows what we mean by translation interpreting as an interpretive use of language. But again, I take it that you're all familiar with the concept of interpretive use. So the translator's task, its main aim and task is to achieve optimal relevance, to understand at each point what contextual effects were inferred in the original context, and thereby form a comprehensive hypothesis of the intended interpretation of the original, consisting of both explicatures and implicatures. So this is the translator-interpreter's main aim. Faithfulness, according to this definition, is therefore a matter of yielding the intended interpretation of the source text through adequate contextual effects that avoid unnecessary processing effort. So we need to start modeling the translators and interpreters' competence. It takes a high level of meta-representational skills to manage different interpretations and cognitive environments. And Gut therefore proposes this and defends this competence-oriented research on translation. He calls it CORT, and its main aim is to seek to understand translation and interpreting through understanding the communicative competence that makes it possible for both the translator and his or her audience. Now, I was saying that Good's approach has had a huge legacy in my field, both in terms of translation studies, as you can see, especially experimental translation studies, both all validated empirically over the years, over the past 30 years, from his notion of translation in different fields of study, from style and figurative language to all the way to audiovisual translation, and in a framework of interdisciplinarity. Again, in different sectors, from sci-tech, AVT, post-editing, machine translation, etc., etc. So different methodologies, different fields of study, and different notions that are being validated empirically. His legacy, however, is also in the world of interpreting studies, both in the conference interpreting setting in simultaneous mode, conference interpreting in consecutive mode, and dialogue interpreting, especially the legal sector. There's a huge difference in between translation and interpreting, according to relevance theory-oriented research on the subject. I take it from Seton and Dorrant, 2016, that the main difference lies in this, that translation has an intensity of expanded cognitive effort that's relatively low most of the time. And in interpreting, this intensity can be very high when the speaker is fast, speaks with a strong accent, when the speech is informationally very dense. So Seton and Dorrant say these norms and the possibilities are more circumscribed. So our focus, especially for interpreter training, must shift to process. So there's a difference there in focus between translation and interpreting training, according to Seton and Dorrant. In terms of methodological issues, both in the field of relevance theory-oriented translation and interpreting studies, there has been a focus on interdisciplinarity. I said it at the beginning of my talk. And this is because obviously these communicative arcs are very complex, and we need to take into account both external and internal cognitive factors, with the latter fully or partly based on the former, obviously. So an interdisciplinary outlook is a good balance between applied pragmatics here and other mostly sociological disciplinary translated traditions and perspectives. And according to me, what I state in my volume as well, there are multiple points of interface between sociocultural and cognitive pragmatic approaches to human communication, especially in the context of, content of situated context. Now, there are other factors and key vectors of development in terms of methodology that I discussed in my volume in the field of relevance theory-oriented translation and interpreting studies. First of all, there's been a move towards triangulation. There's been a move towards integrating product and process, with, as I was saying, with a focus on product when it comes to interpreting studies. There's been a move towards the expansion of the object of study to all participants in the communicative event. So think of police interpreting, users as well as interviewees, interviewers, interpreters, everyone, every user, every participant has been taken into account. Also, another development is to do with the gradual coming together of studies of different modalities, including multimodal presentations, thinking about audiovisual products that I mentioned before, and experimental testing, which is in line with what's happening in pragmatic research as well. So in this sense, you can think of translation and interpreting studies as contributions to relevance theory experimental research as well. And I hope, obviously, that's going to be the case more and more in the future. So when I talk about experimental work in my field, I mean questionnaire-based work. I mean corpora, data from reading and response times in translation in particular. I mean evidence from EEG, fMRI, use of eye tracking technology, both in interpreting and translation. And there's other ways, obviously, of testing and developing ideas, use of data from corpora and other observational work, and application of relevance theory in clinical work, language acquisition, first and second language learning and teaching, stylistics that are being integrated into the study of translation or interpreting. Just to give you an example, quick example, I know I've got about 3 minutes left. It's Alves and others, 2019. They work on translation. They take it from Gride's view of pragmatics, obviously, relevance theory, GUT, and TOM. And they see translation processes as requiring deduction stemming from a cognitive context, from propositions derived from the meaning of the utterance, as well as from inferentially driven processes. They put forward an experimental paradigm, which has been used and used time and time again. And on a neurobiological level, they talk about the inferential nature of translation processing, recruiting some of the regions typically involved in tasks involving reasoning about the mental states of others, particularly the bilateral inferior parietal lobe. So now that we have kind of summarized very quickly, unfortunately, the theoretical methodological implications of this research, we might have to ask ourselves, what are the practical applications, especially in terms of training and curricula? Well, we have to, I think, start introducing this concept in the training of translators and interpreters. First of all, the meta cross-pragmatic competence that was talked about by Gut, as I was saying before, but also other concepts need to be discussed in a proper training for translators and interpreters. Concepts of fidelity, seen as optimal interpretive resemblance, as I was telling you before. Quality, seen as interpretive resemblance plus relevance. The difference between implicit and explicit competence, the role of clues and procedural meaning, which I won't have the time to talk about with you now, but it's huge in translation interpreting. Cognitive efficiency, monitoring skills, and ethical implications, which are always up there in my mind. Very quickly, this is an example of classroom task that I discuss in my volume to do with clues in the source text and how we can translate them into a target text. As you can see, I divide it into different questions, sub-questions, the main task, and obviously all this taking into account the relevance theoretic framework. So just to conclude, I've got 1 minute left. Translation and interpreting are all about the retrieval of hidden indirect meaning in utterances. This theory has been fairly popular over the past 30 years to explain this topics. And scholars have adopted relevance theory and translation interpreting studies in different ways, mainly to do with Gut's approach, how it sheds light on a plethora of phenomena, and they tend to adopt an interdisciplinary descriptive qualitative method of inquiry. And last but not least, there's a difference between the approaches to interpreting and translation. In interpreting, the main focus has been on the product rather than the process. It can be used as tools and notions in training as well, education, recruitment policies, regulation, and raising awareness, including all the key players. So I hope that obviously we're far from exhausting its field of inquiry. I hope that further research will be done, and many scholars will be looking towards an all-around account of translation and interpreting, which has been pointed towards before, but I think we're quite far from it and still await large-scale investigation. Said that, I hope to see you at the conference, first Arctic conference in Rome in February 2023, where we'll be discussing this topic on translation interpreting further with Professor Alvis and Professor Robin. So thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take all your questions for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A perfect 20 minutes. Congratulate you on that.
Rushing it.
I'd like to open the floor now for questions. If I have a couple for sure, but
have I stopped sharing my
no,
screen?
not yet, but I think I can stop you from, no, I cannot. You haven't yet stopped sharing.
I think I have now.
Now you have, yes.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Perhaps I'll again start with, oh, okay, I thought three are cool. I will start with one. I mean, I agree completely with what you've said. I mean, this brings me many years back when I was doing my master's in translation and interpreting, and I looked a bit at relevance theory and how it relates to drama translation and whatnot. I think that one of the aspects that is not covered a lot, at least when it comes to the relevance theoretic approach to translation specifically, because interpreting, I think, is all about adaptation, is the extent to which what you're translating is meant, the audience, like what is the intended audience of your translation work. So, for example, I recall, like, when I was researching this or whatnot, I mean, I think that there needs to be made a distinction between, like, having theatrical plays that are going to be circulated as books, let's say, for people to read, where you can include all these contextual information that people might not have, as opposed to theatrical plays being translated for actual theaters, so to be played, where you need to a certain extent, adapt the text, right? I mean, because if the people miss the references, then they won't be able to make sense of what's happening. So I'm wondering, like, and now that you talked about interpretation, I think that this is pretty much like interpretation tends to be more on the adaptation side, in the sense that, you know, you have to give the gist of what somebody's saying rather than a close reading. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this. I mean, like, yes, there are communicative clues, blah, 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 whatnot, but to what extent can a translator or interpreter be free enough, like, because it is a metacognitive task, but are we free to just alter completely what someone says? Because he was into this Bible translation stuff, he was also very close to the original towards the end of his book. So just you know, wondering what your thoughts are on this.
Well, thank you. So first of all, Gut was the first one to actually mention that I don't know if you remember that passage in his book where he talks about translating for a population of people in Ethiopia. And he talks about having to adapt the issue of fishing and what's the Mount Sinai stands for and where it is in Palestine. And so he actually, even in his time, he talks about having to adapt to some culture-bound terms and references. But I think over the past 30 years, especially in translation, I would say actually, and especially in figurative language and literature, in ads, so translation, advertisement, jokes, irony with use or diasporas, and audiovisual translation, there has been a lot of debate on the issue of having to experiment with transposing this culture-bound references. So I don't think it's context dependent. I think it happens throughout translation and interpreting as a communicative act. But there's definitely some, especially when it comes to literature and drama, obviously, and figurative language and advertisement, there's definitely some genres and textual genres that are more prone to having to be adapted than others, for obvious reasons. When it comes to legal interpreting, then especially the main gist of legalese, there's not much adaptation apart from having to move from one legal system to another. But Gut himself in 1991 talked about having to translate the Bible into Ethiopian and having to do that kind of move, as it were.
Okay, that's really, and then with regards to interpreting, I think that the process can be like slightly different because you don't have enough time to plan whether you're going to be adapting or
That's what I was saying about Seton and Doran's work in 2016. They do mention that there's a difference. You know, the intensity in interpreting is very high. So we have speakers with strong accents. We have speech that's informationally so dense that you don't have that time. So we need to focus on the process, you know, rather than the product. And it's quite time, time consuming, and it's you're on the spot all the time.
Yeah, sure, for sure. I can go on unless someone else has a question. I mean, well, I mean, I'm also wondering, like, because you posited these experimental, Ryoko maybe, and then I can conclude with the question. Yes, Ryoko?
Thank you. Just more comments than question, really. Listening to your presentation, what I was thinking was, when we say translation and interpreting studies per se, it seems to be a good idea to think about like training and practice and so on. But then when you start thinking about different types, like Stavros was saying earlier, there are that involves like really a wide range of constraints. So even within AVT, subtitling and dubbing have two completely different constraints. On the one hand, dubbing, for example, have to be synced with sort of physical and image and all other things, while subtitling might have more issues with the number of words, for example, characters. And when you start thinking about other creative genre, then there may be more constraints. But if it is like yourself, quote interpreting, you have to be completely faithful. But as you prove yourself in your work, there are interpreters present in the dialogue. So I was thinking, how do you think relevance theory could help us, could help different areas of translation and interpreting study and training? And maybe I was also thinking about the role of sort of dynamic context, dynamic understanding of context in relevance theory. I think that will be very crucial in translation and interpreting study, but I don't think they are not looking at it, because people in translation studies often think it is the matter of cognitive load and how to create effective process. So just wondered what can we do from relevant theoretic perspective?
Right, so I'll start off with the first part of your question because it's easier. The issue of context is quite complex, I think, and it will take us a whole new conference in itself, I think. But starting from your first part of the question, I can say that in terms of training, I think we need to start putting forward the idea that languages differ not only in the patterns of structure employed, but also in the inferential routes that these patterns can trigger. So, and this is a new thing for translation interpreter training. And for us, it's very normal to put things in this perspective, but not in my world. So if we can just start making sure that people start thinking about how to change or preserve a given syntactic or arrangement, if it's possible in the source text, that would ensure optimal interpretive resemblance in a target text. How is that even possible? You can put that as a question to your students. Can you explain how that changing or preserving is possible? What do you understand by optimal interpretive resemblance, etc., etc.? And then you start thinking cross-pragmatically. So so do you know enough about cross-pragmatic differences between the source text and target text languages in the first place? And let's look at this context, be it a translation or interpretation. Do we have to assume that certain communicative acts enjoy a reasonable degree of universality or not? How can we be sure that this is the case? I think about irony all the time, especially in audiovisual translation. How can you, with the constraints that you have in audiovisual translation, the 40 characters or whatnot in Latin languages, how can you convey a similar or cognitive environment? So trainers, I think, need to be trained in the first place in this types of pragmatic thinking or cross-pragmatic thinking, and then look at the specific textual genres or contexts and discuss them with the students. That's my idea of training in this sense. As for the issue of context, I mean, I've started looking at it during my PhD with Diane, and I'm still looking at it. What I can say is, I was mentioning it in my talk. We need to, well, utterance interpretation does encompass both external and internal factors. There's no doubt about it. And even, you know, Deirdre Wilson and Dan Speber in their book, they acknowledge this in the post phase. So we know that that for all practical purposes in translation interpreting, however, only the external factors can be described and modeled. This is our problem as researchers, obviously. With any claim to objectivity and to accuracy, we can only say that external factors can be described, right? Even if you do some observational work and then interviews and questionnaires and whatnot, let's face it, we can only describe external factors. So I think this interdisciplinary outlook is a good balance between a micro-pragmatic and a macro-ideological or macro-sociological disciplinary tradition that has to be there, because especially in both translation and interpreting, this is so obvious. How you strike the balance, this point of interface between social, cultural, and cognitive pragmatic approaches to human communication, I'm still not sure. I was saying during my talk that I think the idea of situated context might be seen as similar in, let's say, Goffman's interactionist perspective and relevance theory in some ways. The issue of situated, so being in context, right? But obviously, they take it from very different perspectives on human communication. So it's a question that I put out there for all of us to think about, I hope.
Well, thank you very much, Fabrizio. I'm sorry, I just need to, I mean, I think we can keep the discussion if you want, because Jan's talk has been cancelled. I'm not sure whether we need to leave the room or not, but if we can't, you can keep chatting. If we
we don't need to leave the room. So similarly, if there's any further questions for Angelica, then we can keep the discussion going.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely.
Obviously, anybody who wants to go to the other rooms,
I mean, if anybody wants to attend any of the other sessions, they are very more than welcome to do so. Sorry, so Fabrizio, you can go on.
No, well, then I would put it out there for all of you, because it's mentioned in my volume that's coming out now, and I have no answer to this. I can only say that in interpreting studies in particular, think about my world, we need to adopt this interdisciplinary perspective, because human communication is such a complexity that you can't deny that is the case, if you want. But obviously, going back to the issue of context, I mean, if I think of Diane Blakemore and what her face was like when I was talking about Goffman, we need to think that some theories come from very different perspectives, and obviously relevance theory has a very different idea of context than any sociological or other theory, obviously. So what's your thought on this? Have you thought about having to integrate the two?
The context, you mean? Like the notion of context from interactionist and from a cognitive perspective?
Exactly. So the issue of if you have to unite the two, if you want.
I don't think they're incompatible. It's just a matter of making, really, to be honest. I don't know whether that was a question for Yoko.
I'm just kind of thinking, like, just being in a department with strong translation studies, I always see what they're talking about and always get really frustrated about their sort of not thinking about relevance or pragmatic aspect. So what I am thinking is, rather than trying to have this discussion this way, we could actually look at their training program syllabus and then start adding relevance and how we could actually improve. And once we have some material, then we could actually have conversation, but without actually taking the first step, I don't think the discussion will even start, to be honest. That's my side, yeah.
I think you're right. I mean, the context currently I think is seen both as cognitive and social interactional, as I was saying, but I think the context relevant in meaning interpretation is likely to be an amalgamation of both cognitive and social and interactive components. But non-relevance theory-informed translation interpreting studies tend to focus on the social interaction aspects.
Yeah.
So if we are able to contribute to this from a cognitive pragmatic perspective, then we're just adding to, we're just enriching the field.
Yeah. If we could go beyond their understanding of relevance theory, which is basically cost and effect.
Yeah, it's very limited.
Yeah.
I know. Well, that's the reason I wrote the book, because I'm sure my book's not the solution, but at least they give some notions and put out some context out there.
Yeah. So maybe new project of some sort. Yeah.
So just to try and recap the issue of situated context. I think the fact that what's fascinating to me, both Goffman in particular and relevance theory, they take seriously this real-time online nature of situated context, of communication. I see that as a point of interface and interconnection. Context, they consider it a process of joint negotiations of meanings among participants, and the context is seen as a dynamic set of assumptions used by participants. I think that's interesting to me. Although they come from completely different perspectives, but you have this online nature of communication and this dynamic set of assumptions that are being used by participants, don't you think?
But then we need to take into account as well that the relevance theoretic perspective on context does not really acknowledge all those joint
absolutely absolutely, yeah. And that's where the problem lies, and I can still
I tend to agree. I don't think that the problem lies with the joint stuff. I think that it lies with not accepting that there is an element of like interaction, even when it comes to this like super cognitive, like super sub-attentive processes. But anyway, yeah, that's.
Well, I hope that we'll start working on this interface more and more so that we can establish a pattern there. I mean, we could say amongst ourselves that it's normal and it's natural to have interdisciplinarity, but perhaps, if we start doing it in our research, if we tackle some issues.
I think that the problem is not identifying this specific aspect. I think that the problem is the difference of perspective more generally, because apparently there seems to be like this sort of territorialism, like, no, you're wrong about what you're saying. No, you're wrong about what you're saying. So I think that it's more people sort of like intrinsic evaluations of each other's work rather than
being scared of the new
I'm not sure if it's being scared or anything, but it's also a matter of like, I mean, if argumentation is, as Sperber and Mercier have argued, the matter of convincing, you tend to get all the more defensive of your own.
But that you can say that from the other side as well, because what Ryoka was saying is true. I mean, it reflects a lot of interpreting consolidation departments. They just think about Bryan and Levinson, politeness theory, and
the very systematic function grammar.
The systematic functional,
yes,
and
of course,
and then when you start mentioning cognitive aspects or implicatures or whatnot, they just scare away from it. It's almost like a knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah, I think it's a similar situation when you try to to get a formal philosopher into statistics or something, right?
Don't even mention it. Don't try and go there.
Fabrizio, since we stayed here, let me ask you something about translation. We see nowadays people always questioning past productions, for example, from the 70s and the 80s, and they say, this is inappropriate and that. okay, when we are translating, of course, we are not creating, we cannot change what is there. But do you think because of this, translators nowadays, they are actually taking more into account context? Because, even when you think about, let's say Shakespeare, and we translate it, if it was translated in the 60s, they might have chosen certain words, based on the context, or maybe they didn't take into account, they just thought, this is gonna be forever. But then if you translate it now, you think about it, but then you also think, well, in a couple of years, people are gonna be questioned, this is inappropriate. What do you think?
Well, I think that, I can speak from a relevance theoretic perspective. I think that more and more scholars out there are saying that you have to model this meta representational competence. You need to manage different interpretations in cognitive environments. So you need that ability to tell in another language what was first told in another language with this meta representational skill. So I would say more and more this is the case, not just in relevance theoretic translation studies. Overall, we've had feminist adaptations of Dante's Divine Comedy. We've had gender studies based adaptations of Shakespeare. So yes, absolutely. What do I think about this? I think that the translator in this case has to be formed and trained in order to recognize faithfulness, and has to be trained on the notion of faithfulness in translation before they can tackle Shakespeare of Dante or Odysseus, etc. Because otherwise you just go the other way. So I don't know, I've read some feminist translation of Dante's Divine Comedy, and then the risk there is that you kind of take the main purpose of the original writers out completely and make it something your own, which you can do because literature is free for you to grasp, but then in that case you would only look at yourself and what your purpose is, and not consider the original writer's perspective at all. And I would say in relevance theoretic terms, then you're not yielding the intended interpretation of the source text anymore. You're not doing it. And then you can do it for political reasons or whatever reasons, but then you need to make sure to be aware that you're not yielding this interpretation of the source text anymore. There's no adequate contextual effects. You are not avoiding unnecessary processing effort. You're actually making it harder, and you're adding it to the effort. You see what I mean? So if you are aware of this, if you've been trained properly, and you say, no, I want to take it from a feminist perspective, and because it's a political stance, then yes, please do. But then you need to be aware that you're leading your reader somewhere else, if you see what I mean. Yeah. It's all a question of training and awareness, I guess, in all sectors. But I hope that it kind of answers some of your questions, and I do hope to see you in February. Stavros, you still need to send me your paper. I want to know all about Greek drama, both
drama of all things, right? I don't know, when is it in February?
It's the beginning of February. It's 6th, hold on a second, 9th and 10th of February. So
okay. I'll really consider it, though I do have a multiplier event for an EU project that I'm organizing here.
Translation is above all the most important.
Of course, yes. Anything else tramples, of course, by comparison. Well, thank you very much to both. I think I'm going to try that's the ending of another talk, unless you have anything else you'd like to chat about, or
no, I think now it's time for us to join our friends. Now that we have done our part, and we're going to
enjoy the rest of the talks. Well, see you later.